The banquet hall fell silent as Margaret Evans, 67, rose from her seat. 200 pairs of eyes watched as she smoothed her teal dress and straightened her back. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice carried clearly across the room. "I am the mother of the groom," she said, looking directly at the crowd of well-dressed strangers. "And this house belongs to me." Champagne glasses froze midway to lips. The bride's mother's smile stiffened. Thomas, her son, stared at her with a mixture of shame and awe, but Margaret wasn't finished. "And I'd like to tell you how we got here." 3 weeks earlier. The cream-colored envelope caught Margaret's eye as soon as she pulled open her mailbox. It stood out from the usual stack of bills and flyers, expensive and formal. Her heart quickened as she recognized her son's handwriting on the return address. Margaret had just returned from her Tuesday watercolor class at the Oak Ridge Senior Center, still wearing her paint-splattered smock over a simple cotton dress. At 67, she'd found unexpected joy in art after retiring from nursing 3 years ago. The class had become her sanctuary, a place where she created something beautiful every week, even as her world had grown quieter. She hurried inside, dropping her canvas bag on the kitchen counter and settling into the worn armchair by the window. George's chair, though he'd been gone for 12 years now. The late afternoon sun streamed through the curtains, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. A wedding invitation, just as she'd hoped. Her only son, Thomas, was finally marrying Abigail, his girlfriend of 3 years. Margaret had been expecting this, praying for it, really. Family meant everything to her. But as she unfolded the thick cardstock, her smile faltered. "Mr. and Mrs. William Harrison request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Abigail Marie Harrison, to Thomas George Evans." Margaret read it twice, then a third time, her eyes scanning desperately for her own name. It wasn't there, not as a host, not as the mother of the groom. She was simply a recipient, like any other guest. And then she saw the location. Pine Haven, Lake Windermere. Margaret's heart stopped. Pine Haven was her home. The lake house she and George had built in 1978, the place where they'd raised Thomas. The property was still in her name. They were having the wedding at her house, and they hadn't even mentioned her name on the invitation. "There must be a mistake," she whispered to the empty room, but the elegant script remained unchanged. The Harrisons were hosting a wedding at her home, and she was just another guest. She set the invitation down carefully on the coffee table, as if handling something that might shatter, or perhaps it was she who felt fragile. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. "Did you get it?" Betty's familiar voice demanded without preamble. Margaret sighed. "Hello to you, too. Betty?" "Don't hello, Betty, me. Did you get the invitation to Thomas's wedding?" "I did," Margaret said, her voice careful, measured. And I think I need the Wednesday girls." 2 hours later, Margaret's kitchen buzzed with the energy of 3 additional women in their 60s, each bearing dishes and righteous indignation. The Wednesday girls had been meeting every Wednesday for nearly 50 years, since college, through marriages, children, divorces, careers, and losses. They had remained constants in each other's lives. Betty Scott arrived first, as she always did, with a casserole and a scowl. At 68, she was the oldest by a few months and never let anyone forget it. A retired high school principal, she still approached problems with administrative efficiency and zero tolerance for nonsense. "This is beyond rude," she declared, examining the invitation. "It's cruel." Dorothy Chen arrived next, carrying a bottle of wine and calm pragmatism. The former attorney had always been the voice of reason in their group. "Let's think this through before we jump to conclusions," she said. though her face betrayed her own displeasure at the invitation. Gladys Wilkins completed their quartet, bringing homemade cookies and relentless optimism, widowed like Margaret. She had built a successful flower shop business after her husband's death. "Maybe it's a printing error," Gladys suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. "Maybe they sent the wrong version." The four women gathered around Margaret's kitchen table, the invitation sitting in the center like evidence at a trial. "They're getting married at Pine Haven," Margaret said quietly. "My house, and they didn't even ask. How is that possible?" Dorothy frowned. "You still own it, don't you?" "Of course I do. After George died, I never changed anything. Thomas has been using it occasionally, but it's still in my name." "Then they can't just commandeer it for a wedding," Betty said firmly. "Have you spoken to Thomas about this?" Gladys asked. Margaret shook her head. "We don't talk as much as we used to, especially since he met Abigail. It's not that I don't like her, it's just she's a snob," Betty interjected. "Betty?" Gladys admonished. "Well, she is. Those few times we've met her, she's looked at us like we're artifacts in a museum. Fascinating, but outdated." Margaret didn't argue. There was truth to Betty's assessment, though she would never say so about her future daughter-in-law. "What are you going to do?" Dorothy asked, practical as always. "I don't know. I should probably just call Thomas and ask about it." "No," Betty said firmly. "First, we need to establish your legal position. Do you have the deed to Pine Haven?" Margaret nodded. "Somewhere in my files. In the study." "Let's find it," Dorothy said. "Then we'll decide how to proceed." The four women moved to Margaret's small home office, digging through filing cabinets and folders. As Margaret searched through a box of important papers, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She paused, pulling out a small velvet pouch. "What's that?" Gladys asked, peering over her shoulder. Margaret carefully opened the pouch and tipped a silver brooch into her palm. The antique piece featured a delicate pattern of forget-me-nots in silver filigree. "My grandmother's brooch," Margaret said softly. "It's been passed down for generations. Each bride in our family wears it on her wedding day." She swallowed hard. "I was saving it for Thomas's wife." The room fell silent as the full weight of the exclusion settled over them. "Well," Betty said finally, her voice unusually gentle, "I think it's time to find that deed." The deed to Pine Haven was exactly where Margaret thought it would be, in a folder labeled Property in the back of her filing cabinet. Dorothy examined it with professional scrutiny. Confirming what Margaret already knew, the lake house was solely in her name since George's death in 2011. "It's legally yours, no question," Dorothy confirmed. "They have no right to use it without your permission, let alone host a wedding there." The four women had moved back to the kitchen table, where they now sat surrounded by half-eaten cookies and empty wine glasses. Evening had fallen, casting long shadows across the room. "I should have seen this coming," Margaret said softly. "Thomas has been different since he met Abigail. Calls less, visits less. When they do come over, Abigail always seems uncomfortable, like my home isn't good enough." "When was the last time you visited Pine Haven?" Gladys asked. Margaret thought for a moment. "Last summer, I guess. Thomas said they were doing some renovations, making it more modern. He didn't want me to come until they were finished." She frowned. "That was almost a year ago." "So they've been planning this for some time," Dorothy observed. "Tell us about Pine Haven," Gladys prompted gently. "You and George built it, right?" Margaret's expression softened at the memories. "We saved for years to buy that land. George designed most of it himself. He was so proud of that. We built it in '78, just after Thomas was born." The memories flooded back, George standing shirtless on the half-finished deck, hammer in hand, sweat glistening on his shoulders. Thomas as a toddler, splashing in the shallows of the lake while Margaret watched from the shore. Family cookouts on the 4th of July, with neighbors joining them for fireworks viewed from their dock. George taught Thomas to fish off that dock, she continued. I can still see them. Thomas couldn't have been more than 10, sitting there at sunrise with their lines in the water. Thomas caught his first bass there. She remembered Thomas's face, beaming with pride as he held up the fish. Look, Mom, Dad says I'm a natural. George always said Pine Haven would be our legacy to Thomas. Margaret said, but I never thought that he'd take it over while you're still alive, Betty finished bluntly. Margaret nodded. I worked so hard for that place. 35 years as a nurse, double shifts sometimes, so we could afford it and Thomas could go to college without debt. And now his fancy fiancé and her parents are acting like it's theirs, Betty said, her indignation returning. We don't know that Thomas is behind this, Gladys pointed out. He might be caught in the middle. Either way, Margaret needs to assert herself, Dorothy said firmly. The question is, how? They discussed options late into the evening. Betty advocated for confrontation. Call Thomas immediately and demand an explanation. Gladys suggested a gentler approach. Write a letter expressing hurt feelings, but offering to help with the wedding. Dorothy recommended a legal reminder of ownership, perhaps through a formal letter. Margaret listened to her friends, grateful for their support, but uncertain about which path to take. As the night wore on, a plan began to form in her mind. I'm not going to call, she said finally, and I'm not going to send the invitation back. What are you going to do? Gladys asked. Margaret straightened her shoulders, channeling a strength she hadn't felt in years. I'm going to go to Pine Haven. I'm going to attend my son's wedding, not just as a guest, but as the mother of the groom and the owner of the house. Betty grinned. Now that's what I'm talking about. Are you sure? Dorothy asked cautiously. It could get awkward. It's already awkward, Margaret replied. But I won't be erased, not from my son's life, and not from my own property. As her friends were leaving, Margaret walked them to their cars. In the parking lot of her apartment complex, she spotted a familiar face, Michael Donovan, Thomas's friend from high school. Mrs. Evans, he called, walking over. It's been ages. They chatted briefly, with Michael asking about Thomas and the upcoming wedding. I didn't get an invitation, he admitted. But I heard about it from mutual friends. Sounds like quite the event they're planning at the lake house. Yes, it does, Margaret said carefully. Michael shook his head. Thomas showed me pictures of what they've done to the place. Abigail convinced him it needed to be modernized for their lifestyle. Between us, I barely recognized it. Margaret's heart sank. What do you mean? Oh, you know, out with the old, in with the new. Abigail has very specific tastes. Minimalist, I think they call it. He must have noticed Margaret's expression because he quickly added, but I'm sure it looks great, just different. After Michael left, Betty squeezed Margaret's hand. All the more reason to go and see for yourself. And remind them whose house it really is, Dorothy added. As Margaret watched her friends drive away, she felt a new resolve hardening within her. She wouldn't be relegated to the background of her son's life, or her own property. It was time to stand up for herself. The drive to Pine Haven took just over 2 hours, a journey Margaret had made countless times before. She drove her 1988 Ford Taurus, a car George had lovingly maintained until his death and which she had kept running since then. The familiar purr of the engine was comforting as Elvis Presley's "Can't Help Falling in Love" played softly on the radio, their song, hers and George's. The route was etched into her memory, the turn off the highway, the winding road through pine forests, the final curve that revealed the first glimpse of Lake Windermere sparkling in the distance. Margaret had always felt her shoulders relax at that moment, the tension of everyday life melting away at the sight of the water. But today, as she rounded that final curve, tension coiled tighter in her chest. The lake was the same, vast and blue under the spring sunshine, but Pine Haven was almost unrecognizable. The cabin George had designed, with its blue clapboard siding and white trim, had been transformed. It was now stark white, with black modernist fixtures. A showpiece rather than a home. The wraparound porch where they'd spent countless evenings watching the sunset had been reduced to a sleek, angular deck with glass railings. Margaret pulled over to the side of the road, a quarter-mile from the house, needing a moment to absorb the shock. This wasn't renovation. This was erasure. Every trace of the home she and George had created seemed to have been wiped away. She watched from a distance as people moved around the property. Workers were setting up what looked like an outdoor event space near the lake. A woman with a clipboard, Abigail, Margaret recognized, directed them with precise gestures. Thomas followed behind her, nodding and occasionally offering input that Abigail mostly seemed to dismiss. Margaret was about to start the car again when something caught her eye. An older man, perhaps in his 70s, was carefully digging up plants from a side garden. He placed each one in a pot with surprising tenderness. With a jolt, Margaret realized they were her lilac bushes, the ones she'd planted the year Thomas was born, that had bloomed every spring since, curiosity overcoming caution. Margaret left her car and approached the man. "Excuse me," she called softly. He looked up, startled, then smiled in recognition. "Mrs. Evans. Well, I'll be—" It took her a moment to place him. "Mr. Rodriguez Victor." "Yes, ma'am." He stood, wiping soil from his hands. "Didn't expect to see you today." Victor Rodriguez had been their neighbor years ago, before retiring and moving to Florida. George had helped him renovate his house after Victor returned from Vietnam, when contractors wouldn't work with a veteran suffering from what they didn't yet call PTSD. "What are you doing with the lilacs?" Margaret asked. Victor's weathered face creased with concern. "Saving them, if I can. The wedding planner wanted them removed, said they didn't match the aesthetic. Seemed ashamed to kill perfectly good bushes, especially ones with history." "You remember them?" "Course I do. George helped me plant some at my place after seeing how pretty yours were." He gestured to the pots. "Thought I'd keep them safe till after all this wedding business is done, maybe replant them where they won't offend anybody's sensibilities." Margaret felt a rush of gratitude toward this man who understood the value of things with roots. "Are you here for the wedding preparations?" Victor asked. "In a manner of speaking," Margaret replied. "I didn't know they were this far along." And Victor frowned. "Been working on the place for months now. Figured you knew, being the owner and all." "I knew there were renovations. I didn't know they were—" She gestured toward the transformed house, unable to find the right word. "Extensive." Victor supplied diplomatically. "That's one way to put it." Margaret took a deep breath. "Well, I suppose I should announce myself." Victor nodded. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Evans, it's good to see you back at Pine Haven. Place hasn't felt right without you." With those words bolstering her courage, Margaret walked up the gravel drive toward the house that had once been her sanctuary. Thomas saw her first. He was helping move chairs across the lawn when he froze mid-step, his face a picture of shock. "Mom," he called, setting down the chairs and hurrying toward her. "What are you doing here?" Before she could answer, Abigail appeared from around the side of the house. At 32, she was strikingly beautiful in a carefully curated way. Honey blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail, not a wrinkle in her cream linen outfit despite the day's work. "Margaret," she said, surprise quickly masked by a polite smile. "We weren't expecting you." "Clearly," Margaret replied, keeping her voice even. "I received the wedding invitation." An awkward silence descended. Thomas looked from his mother to his fiancée, seemingly at a loss for words. "Well," Abigail said finally, "you're here now. Would you like some iced tea? We're quite busy with preparations. As you can see—" "I can see that you're very busy," Margaret agreed. "At my house." Thomas winced. "Mom, we were going to call you. The invitation had the Harrisons listed as hosts for a wedding at Pine Haven," Margaret finished for him. "My Pine Haven?" "Margaret," Abigail began, her tone shifting to one you might use with a difficult child. "We discussed the renovations with Thomas months ago. He agreed that updating the aesthetic would—" "I'm not talking about renovations. Abigail," Margaret interrupted. "I'm talking about hosting a wedding at a property you don't own without so much as asking the actual owner." Abigail's smile tightened. "Thomas's family. We assumed—" "You assumed wrong," Margaret said, opening her purse and removing the deed she'd brought. "Pine Haven is still solely in my name." Thomas stepped forward, his expression pained. "Mom, please, can we talk about this privately?" The sound of another car on the gravel drive drew their attention. A sleek black SUV pulled up, and an elegant couple in their 60s emerged. Margaret recognized them immediately from photos. William and Eleanor Harrison, Abigail's parents. "Is everything all right?" William called as they approached, his gaze flickering between his daughter and the unexpected visitor. "Mom, this is a surprise," Abigail said, her voice artificially bright. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, this is Margaret Evans, Thomas's mother." "Ah, Mrs. Evans," Eleanor said, extending a manicured hand. "How lovely to finally meet you." "And you," Margaret replied, shaking the offered hand. "I understand you're hosting my son's wedding at my house." Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. "Your house, I thought—" She looked toward Abigail and Thomas. "There seems to be some confusion," William said smoothly. "Perhaps we should all go inside and sort this out." Inside, Pine Haven was as transformed as the exterior. The cozy, rustic interior, with its stone fireplace and comfortable furniture, had been replaced by stark minimalism: white walls, sleek surfaces, and uncomfortable-looking modern furniture. Margaret barely recognized the space where she'd spent so many happy years. They gathered in what had once been the living room. Margaret sat in a chair that seemed designed for appearance rather than comfort, facing the two couples. "Let me be clear," she said before anyone else could speak. "I'm not here to cause problems. I'm here because I received an invitation to my son's wedding that didn't include my name, at a property that I own, which is being used without my permission." "Margaret," William began, his tone conciliatory but condescending. "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. Thomas gave us the impression that Pine Haven was available for the wedding." "Did he also give you the impression that I wasn't his mother?" Margaret asked quietly. Thomas looked stricken. "Mom, no, of course not. The invitation was—it was an oversight." "An oversight," Margaret repeated, like forgetting to mention renovations that erased every trace of the home your father built. "The renovations were necessary," Abigail interjected. "The place was dated." "It was filled with memories," Margaret corrected. "Memories that apparently didn't fit your aesthetic." Eleanor Harrison cleared her throat. "I think we're getting off track. The wedding is in 3 days. We have guests coming from across the country. Surely we can work something out." Margaret studied the woman before her, perfectly coiffed, expensively dressed, used to getting her way. She recognized the type from her years in nursing, wealthy patients who expected special treatment and usually received it. "Yes," Margaret said finally. "We can work something out. The wedding can proceed as planned, under 2 conditions." "Conditions?" William's eyebrows rose. "First, I will be acknowledged as the mother of the groom and the owner of this property in all remaining communications about the wedding." "And that's perfectly reasonable," Thomas said quickly. "Second, I'll be staying here until the wedding. In my house." Abigail's composure slipped. "Staying here? But where we've repurposed all the rooms for the wedding party." "I'm sure you can find space for the owner of the house," Margaret replied calmly. A tense silence fell over the room. Finally, Thomas stood. "Mom's right. She should stay here. We can move some things around in the blue bedroom." "The blue bedroom is set up for hair and makeup," Abigail protested. "Then we'll move it," Thomas said with unexpected firmness. "Mom stays." Abigail looked like she wanted to argue, but instead nodded tightly. "Fine. I'll have someone prepare the room." As the others dispersed to continue with wedding preparations, Thomas asked Margaret to join him on the dock, the one part of Pine Haven that remained largely unchanged. They sat side by side, feet dangling above the water as they had countless times before. "I'm sorry about the invitation," Thomas said after a long silence. "It wasn't my idea to leave your name off." "But you allowed it," Margaret observed. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that it made Margaret's heart ache. "I've been caught in the middle, trying to please everyone. Except me. It seems that's not fair, Mom. Isn't it? When was the last time you called just to talk or visited without Abigail? When did you plan to tell me about transforming Pine Haven?" Thomas looked out over the water, shame evident in his profile. "Things have been complicated. Life is always complicated. Thomas, that's not an excuse to forget the people who love you." He turned to her then, his expression more vulnerable than she'd seen in years. "I haven't been doing well. Mom, the startup failed 6 months ago. I lost almost everything." Margaret frowned. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Pride, I guess." "I wanted to be successful, like Dad. I didn't want you to see me fail." "Oh, Thomas," Margaret sighed. "Your father failed plenty of times. That's part of life. Abigail's parents helped us out, financially." He hesitated. "There were conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Before Thomas could answer, they heard footsteps on the dock. Abigail appeared, her expression strained. "Thomas, my parents are asking for you. Something about the seating arrangement." As Thomas stood to follow his fiancée, Margaret caught fragments of a hushed conversation between Abigail and her mother near the house. "Can't just show up and take over," Eleanor was saying. "What choice do we have?" Abigail replied. "She owns the place." "For now," William interjected. "But after the wedding, once the papers are signed—" Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lake breeze. What papers? What were they planning for Pine Haven after the wedding? She realized with growing unease that there was more at stake than just her inclusion in a wedding invitation. Something was happening with Pine Haven, something Thomas hadn't told her about. As she watched the Harrisons retreat into her transformed home, Margaret knew she needed to discover exactly what they were planning before the wedding took place. Margaret's first night back at Pine Haven was strange. The blue bedroom, once a cozy guest room with quilts she'd made herself, was now a sterile space with white linens and abstract art. She'd found a few of her old things in boxes in the basement: family photos, George's fishing tackle, Thomas's childhood drawings, apparently deemed unworthy of the house's new aesthetic. She slept fitfully, waking early to the sound of unfamiliar voices. Wedding preparations were already underway, with caterers and decorators arriving at dawn. Margaret dressed simply in slacks and a blouse, then made her way to the kitchen. A young woman was there, arranging flowers at the counter. She looked up as Margaret entered, offering a warm smile that stood out in the cool, redesigned space. "You must be Thomas's mom," she said. "I'm Jane, Abigail's sister and maid of honor." "Margaret," she replied, surprised by the friendly greeting. "Nice to meet you." "Coffee," Jane offered, gesturing to the elaborate espresso machine that had replaced Margaret's old percolator. "I'd love some, but I have no idea how to use that contraption." Jane laughed. "Join the club. Abby always gets the latest gadgets. Here, let me make you one." As Jane worked the machine, Margaret studied her. Unlike Abigail's polished perfection, Jane had a more relaxed air, curly hair pulled into a messy bun, minimal makeup, a genuine smile. "Sorry about the chaos," Jane said, handing Margaret a mug. "Wedding madness, you know. It certainly, is elaborate," Margaret observed. Jane rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Abby doesn't do anything halfway. Mom and Dad's influence. I guess everything has to be perfect." They sat at the kitchen island, watching through the window as workers assembled an arch by the lakeside. "This place is beautiful," Jane said. "Thomas told me you and your husband built it." "We did?" Margaret nodded. "Back in '78. That's amazing, having something you built together." There was a wistfulness in Jane's voice that caught Margaret's attention. "You seem different from your sister," Margaret observed. Jane smiled ruefully. "The black sheep of the Harrison family. I teach elementary school in a public district. Dad's still waiting for me to get serious about a career." "Teaching is one of the most serious careers there is," Margaret said firmly. "I think so too." Jane hesitated. "Look, I should probably say, I was surprised you weren't more involved in the wedding planning. Thomas talks about you all the time." "Does he?" Margaret couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "Oh, yeah. How you raised him after his dad died. Your nursing career. This place. He's really proud of you." Jane fidgeted with her mug. "Between us, I think Abby sometimes feels threatened by me." "Why?" Jane seemed to choose her words carefully. "Our family isn't like yours. We look perfect from the outside, but inside—" She trailed off. "Did Thomas ever tell you about our brother?" Margaret shook her head. "Jason? He was the youngest. Died in a car accident when he was 16. Drunk driver." Jane's eyes clouded with old pain. "It broke Mom. She had severe depression for years. Dad threw himself into work. Abby became the perfect daughter to try to hold everything together." "I'm so sorry," Margaret said softly. "I had no idea." "Abby doesn't talk about it. She's spent her whole life trying to be perfect to make up for the fact that our family isn't—" When she and Thomas got together, I think she saw a chance at a normal family. Jane met Margaret's eyes. "But then there was you, this strong, independent woman who raised an amazing son on her own. You're everything Abby's trying to be, and it scares her." Margaret sat back, processing this new perspective. "That doesn't excuse excluding me from my son's wedding." "No, it doesn't," Jane agreed. "I'm just saying, there's more going on than you might see on the surface." Their conversation was interrupted by Abigail's arrival. She entered the kitchen like a whirlwind, already dressed impeccably despite the early hour. "Jane, there you are," The florist is asking about the centerpieces." She noticed Margaret, and her momentum faltered. "Oh, good morning, Margaret. I see you've met my sister." "We were just getting acquainted," Margaret said. "Jane, could you—" Abigail gestured vaguely toward the door. "Duty calls." Jane sighed, standing. "Nice talking with you. Margaret." After Jane left, an awkward silence fell. Abigail busied herself with her phone, clearly uncomfortable being alone with Margaret. "Your sister seems lovely," Margaret offered. "She is," Abigail agreed, not looking up. "Everyone loves Jane." The wistfulness in her tone made Margaret see Abigail in a new light, not just as the woman who had taken her son away, but as someone struggling with her own insecurities. "Abigail," Margaret began carefully, "I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday." Abigail finally looked up, wariness in her eyes. "I suppose we did. I'm not here to cause problems for you or Thomas. I just want to be part of my son's life." Abigail studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I understand, and I apologize for the invitation oversight." It wasn't a warm reconciliation, but it was a start. As Abigail turned to leave, Margaret asked the question that had been bothering her since yesterday. "Abigail, what plans do you and your parents have for Pine Haven after the wedding?" Abigail froze momentarily, then composed herself. "You should talk to Thomas about that," she said, and quickly left the room. The exchange only deepened Margaret's concerns. Throughout the day, she observed the wedding preparations while trying to piece together what might be happening with her property. She caught glimpses of conversations between the Harrisons and various contractors, discussions about future renovations and investment potential. By evening, as guests began arriving for the rehearsal dinner, Margaret still hadn't found a chance to speak privately with Thomas. She dressed carefully in the teal dress the Wednesday girls had helped her choose, elegant but not flashy, appropriate for the mother of the groom. When she entered the dining area set up on the deck, she discovered her seat was at a table far from the main party with distant relatives and elderly guests. Without making a scene, Margaret quietly moved her place card to the family table. Eleanor Harrison noticed immediately, her smile tightening. "Margaret, I believe there's been a mix-up with the seating." "No mix-up," Margaret replied pleasantly. "As the mother of the groom and the owner of this house, I belong at the family table." William Harrison looked like he might object, but Thomas intervened. "Mom's right. She sits with us." The rehearsal dinner proceeded with forced politeness. Margaret observed the interactions around her, the way William Harrison dominated conversations, how Eleanor watched Abigail with anxious eyes, the strained smiles Thomas offered to his future in-laws. After dinner, while guests mingled, Margaret found herself alone on the dock again. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. It reminded her of countless evenings with George, watching the same view, planning their future. "It's still beautiful, isn't it?" Thomas's voice came from behind her. He sat beside her, loosening his tie. For a moment, they were silent, sharing the view as they had so many times before. "I found Dad's fishing gear in the basement," Margaret said finally. "In a box labeled storage." Thomas winced. "Abigail thought it was cluttering the boathouse." "This was his favorite place," Margaret said softly. "He loved this dock, this view." "I know," Thomas sighed. "I miss him, Mom, every day." "Me too." They sat in silence for a while longer before Margaret gathered her courage. "Thomas, what's happening with Pine Haven after the wedding? Are you selling it?" He looked startled. "What? No, of course not." "Then what are the papers William mentioned, the ones that will be signed after the wedding?" Thomas looked away, guilt written across his face. "How did you hear about that? Does it matter? What's going on, Thomas?" He was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. "Finally," he said. "When my startup failed, I was in bad shape, not just financially, but everything. I felt like I'd failed Dad's legacy. Your father would never— I know that now." Thomas interrupted. "But at the time, I was desperate. William offered to invest in my next venture, enough to get back on my feet, but he wanted—" He trailed off. "Collateral." Margaret finished. Thomas nodded miserably. "I agreed to add Abigail's name to the deed for Pine Haven after we're married. Not selling it, just sharing ownership." Margaret felt like the dock had disappeared beneath her. "You were going to change the deed to my house without telling me it's my inheritance anyway," Thomas said defensively. "And we wouldn't change anything else. You'd still have access any time." "Access?" Margaret repeated incredulously. "To my own home. The one I built with your father. The one I paid for with 35 years of nursing. Mom, please understand. I understand perfectly," Margaret said, rising to her feet. "You were willing to sign away my home to please your future in-laws, and you didn't even have the courage to tell me." She walked away, leaving Thomas on the dock. Her heart was pounding. But beneath the hurt and anger was a strange sense of clarity. Now she knew what was really at stake, not just her inclusion in a wedding, but her home itself. That night, Margaret called the Wednesday girls from her bedroom, keeping her voice low as she explained what she'd discovered. "He was going to sign over your house." Betty's indignation crackled through the speakerphone. "Without telling you, not entirely," Margaret clarified. "Just add Abigail's name to the deed." "Which is the first step to pushing you out completely," Dorothy observed. "Once her name is on it, she has legal rights to make decisions about the property." "What are you going to do?" Gladys asked. Margaret stared out the window at the moonlight on the lake. "I'm still working that out." After ending the call, she sat for a long time, thinking about George, about Thomas, about the legacy they had built together. Eventually, she reached into her suitcase and pulled out the velvet pouch containing her grandmother's silver brooch. The weight of it in her palm was comforting. 5 generations of Evans women had worn it on their wedding days. She had planned to give it to Abigail, to welcome her into the family. Now she wasn't sure. Margaret finally drifted into uneasy sleep, the brooch still clutched in her hand. Margaret woke before dawn on the wedding day. The house was still quiet, the frenetic activity of preparation yet to begin. She dressed in a simple outfit and slipped outside, drawn to the lake as she had been so many mornings before. The mist hovered over the water, creating an ethereal landscape that looked like it belonged in another time. Margaret walked along the shore, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth. This, at least, remained unchanged, the natural beauty that had drawn her and George to this spot so many years ago. She found Victor Rodriguez near the boathouse, already at work replanting some of the salvaged lilacs in pots. "Morning, Mrs. Evans," he greeted her. "Big day today." "Indeed it is," she replied, watching him work. "Those lilacs mean a lot to me." "I figured as much. Way they're handling things around here. Thought these might not survive if I didn't step in." Margaret knelt beside him, fingers brushing the familiar leaves. "George helped me plant the first ones the year Thomas was born. Said he wanted something that would grow along with our son." Victor nodded. "Mr. Evans was a wise man. Understood the importance of roots." "Unlike some people," Margaret said with a sigh. "Young folks are different today," Victor observed without judgment. "Always looking for the new thing, the perfect picture for their internet pages. They forget that real beauty comes with time and care." They worked together for a while, Margaret finding solace in the simple act of tending to the plants that had been part of her family's story. When she finally returned to the house, it was buzzing with activity. Hair and makeup artists had arrived, caterers were setting up in the kitchen, and the wedding coordinator was directing traffic with military precision. Margaret slipped into the kitchen for coffee and found Abigail there alone, still in pajamas, staring out the window with red-rimmed eyes. "Everything all right?" Margaret asked cautiously. Abigail startled, quickly wiping her eyes. "Fine. Just wedding day jitters." Margaret poured herself coffee, then hesitated before sitting across from her future daughter-in-law. "It's normal to be nervous." "And is it normal to wonder if you're making a terrible mistake?" The words seemed to escape before Abigail could stop them. Margaret studied the younger woman's face. "Do you love my son?" "Of course I do," Abigail said without hesitation. "Then what's the mistake you're afraid of making?" Abigail was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know how to do this," she finally admitted. "Marriage, family, my parents, they look perfect from the outside, but they're not. After Jason died, everything changed. Mom checked out emotionally. Dad buried himself in work. I had to be the strong one." "That's a lot of pressure for a child," Margaret observed gently. "I got good at it, being perfect, managing everything." Abigail's voice wavered. "But what if I can't be perfect enough? What if I fail? Thomas, the way my parents failed each other." The vulnerability in Abigail's question caught Margaret off guard. This wasn't the polished, confident woman she'd come to resent. This was someone much younger, carrying wounds Margaret hadn't seen before. "Marriage isn't about being perfect," Margaret said after a moment. "God knows George and I weren't. We fought, we struggled, we made mistakes. But you stayed together. You built this place. You raised Thomas." Abigail looked at her directly. "You're the kind of mother I want to be someday. And that terrifies me because I don't know if I can." Margaret was stunned by the admission. "Why would you say that? Because you did it all on your own after George died. You're strong in a way I'm not sure I am." Abigail hesitated. "That's why I pushed to have my parents host the wedding. Not to exclude you, but because I was afraid I couldn't measure up to you." The confession hung in the air between them, shifting something fundamental in their relationship. "Abigail," Margaret said finally, "I was terrified when I became a mother, and again when George died. I made it up as I went along, just trying to do my best each day." "You did more than that. You raised an amazing man." "Yes, I did," Margaret agreed, "and he chose you. That says something important about who you are." They sat in silence for a moment, the morning sun streaming through the kitchen windows. "I'm sorry about the invitation," Abigail said quietly. "And about the house. I should have insisted Thomas talk to you about everything." "Yes, you should have," Margaret agreed, but without the anger she'd felt before. "Pine Haven isn't just property to me. It's the life George and I built." Abigail nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to understand that." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the bridal party, a flurry of excitement and nervous energy. As Abigail was whisked away to begin preparations, she paused at the door. "Thank you, Margaret," she said simply. Margaret spent the morning observing the transformation of Pine Haven into a wedding venue. White chairs were arranged on the lawn facing the lake. An elegant floral arch stood where the ceremony would take place. Despite her mixed feelings, she had to admit it was beautiful. In her room, Margaret dressed carefully in her teal gown. She pinned up her silver hair and added a touch of makeup. As she was fastening her pearl earrings, George's gift on their 20th anniversary, she made a decision. She took the silver brooch from its pouch and made her way to the master bedroom, now serving as Abigail's bridal suite. She knocked softly and was admitted by Jane. The room was filled with bridesmaids in matching robes, makeup artists, and hairstylists. In the center of it all, Abigail sat in a silk robe, her hair half done. "Margaret," she said, surprised, "is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Margaret assured her. "I just wanted to give you something." The room quieted as Margaret approached. She opened her palm, revealing the silver brooch. "This has been in this Evans family for 5 generations," she explained. "Every bride wears it on her wedding day. It's said to bring a marriage strength and endurance." Abigail's eyes widened. "It's beautiful." "My grandmother wore it in 1920, my mother in 1948. I wore it when I married George in 1977. Margaret held it out. "Now it's your turn." Abigail took the brooch with trembling fingers, genuine emotion crossing her face. "Thank you. This means more than I can say." As Margaret turned to leave, Abigail called after her. "Margaret, would you help me get ready? I'd like my future mother-in-law's opinion on a few things." The invitation, so simple yet so meaningful, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "I'd be honored." The next hour transformed not only Abigail into a bride, but also the relationship between the two women. As they worked together on final details, Margaret shared stories of her own wedding day, and Abigail listened with genuine interest. When Eleanor Harrison arrived to see her daughter, she found Margaret helping Abigail attach the silver brooch to her bouquet. "What's going on here?" Eleanor asked, clearly surprised by the scene. "Margaret gave me a family heirloom for the ceremony," Abigail explained. "Isn't it beautiful, Mom?" Eleanor studied the brooch, then Margaret, with new consideration. "Yes, it is." As the time for the ceremony approached, Abigail made a sudden decision. "I want both of you to walk me down the aisle," she said, looking between her mother and Margaret. "Dad on one side, and you, Margaret, on the other." Eleanor looked startled. "But that's not traditional." "Neither is our family," Abigail said firmly. "And I want both of my mothers there with me." Margaret was speechless. After a moment, Eleanor nodded, a hint of respect in her eyes as she looked at Margaret. "I think that would be lovely," she agreed. The ceremony was everything a wedding should be: emotional, meaningful, beautiful. Margaret watched with pride as Thomas stood beneath the arch, waiting for his bride, when Abigail appeared, escorted by her father and Margaret. A murmur of surprise and approval rippled through the guests. Thomas's face when he saw his mother beside his bride was worth every moment of pain the past few days had brought. His eyes filled with tears, and he mouthed thank you to Margaret as she took her seat in the front row. The vows were personal and heartfelt. Thomas promised to honor both their past and their future. With a meaningful glance at his mother, Abigail pledged to build a home filled with love and understanding, touching the silver brooch on her bouquet. As they were pronounced husband and wife, Margaret felt George's presence beside her, as tangible as the lake breeze. "We did good," she whispered to him. "Our boy did good." The reception was held under a large tent on the lawn. Fairy lights twinkled overhead, and tables were set with elegant but simple arrangements that somehow managed to honor both Abigail's modern taste and the rustic charm of Pine Haven. During dinner, the wedding coordinator surprised everyone by announcing, "And now, the mother of the groom, Margaret Evans, who created Pine Haven, would like to say a few words." Margaret hadn't prepared a speech. She rose slowly, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most strangers. For a moment, she thought of declining, of sitting back down and letting the moment pass. But then she saw Thomas watching her with love and hope. She saw Abigail, the silver brooch catching the light. She saw the Wednesday girls at their table, silently encouraging her, and she thought of George, who always told her she was stronger than she knew. "When my husband George and I built Pine Haven," she began, her voice growing steadier with each word, "we wanted more than a house. We wanted a home where memories could take root and grow, where family could gather, where love could flourish through generations." She looked at Thomas and Abigail. "Today, I see that vision continuing in a new form. Our family is growing, changing, but the foundation remains the same: love, respect, and understanding." Margaret turned to address the entire gathering. "Many of you may not know me. The invitation didn't mention that I'm Thomas's mother or that this house has been my home for over 40 years. A murmur went through the crowd, and she saw the Harrisons shift uncomfortably. "But I'm not here to dwell on oversights," Margaret continued. "I'm here to celebrate new beginnings, to welcome Abigail into our family, to honor the past while embracing the future." She raised her glass. "To Thomas and Abigail, may you build your life together with the same love and commitment that built this house. May you remember that a home isn't made of walls and windows, but of memories and moments shared, and may you always find your way back to each other and to the people who love you." The applause was genuine and warm. Thomas's eyes shone with tears. Abigail mouthed "thank you" across the room. Even the Harrisons seemed moved. As Margaret sat down, Betty leaned over from the next table. "Perfect," she whispered. "You showed them who you are without burning a single bridge." The evening progressed with dancing and celebration. Margaret found herself approached by many guests, curious about the woman who had built Pine Haven and raised Thomas on her own. She shared stories freely, finding unexpected joy in connecting with these new members of her extended family. Later, as the party continued under the stars, Margaret slipped away to the dock for a moment of quiet reflection. The lake was calm, mirroring the night sky and the twinkling lights from the tent. "Mom," Thomas's voice came from behind her. "Mind if I join you?" They sat together, mother and son, in comfortable silence for a while. "I'm sorry," Thomas said eventually. "For everything. The invitation, the house, not being honest with you." "I know you are," Margaret replied. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Pine Haven being more than property." He took a deep breath. "I've talked to Abigail and her parents. We're not going through with the deed change." Margaret turned to him, surprised. "You're not—" Thomas shook his head. "It's your house. Mom, I was wrong to think I could make decisions about it without you. What about William's investment?" "I'll find another way," Thomas said firmly. "Maybe it'll take longer to get back on my feet, but I'll do it right this time." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Your father would be proud of you, not for success or failure in business, but for choosing integrity when it matters." Thomas leaned his head on her shoulder, just as he had as a boy. "I miss him, especially today." "He's here," Margaret said softly, "in the house he built, in the man you've become, in the memories we share." They stayed that way for a while, finding comfort in each other's presence and in the enduring spirit of the man who had helped shape both their lives. The morning after the wedding dawned clear and bright. Margaret woke early, as she always did, and made her way to the kitchen. To her surprise, Thomas and Abigail were already there, still in pajamas, making breakfast together. "Mom," Thomas greeted her with a smile. "We thought you'd sleep in." "Old habits," Margaret replied. "Shouldn't you two be on your way to your honeymoon?" Abigail exchanged a look with Thomas. "We've decided to postpone it. There are more important things to take care of first." Margaret accepted the coffee Thomas offered her. "Such as, for starters, talking to you about the future of Pine Haven," Thomas said. "The real future, not the one we were planning behind your back." They sat at the kitchen table, just the three of them, while the rest of the house slept off the previous night's celebration. "We were wrong," Abigail began directly, "about everything. The wedding planning, the renovations, the deed. I got caught up in creating the perfect event and lost sight of what really matters. And I was too afraid of disappointing everyone to stand up for what's right," Thomas added. Margaret looked between them, seeing genuine remorse and a new maturity in both their faces. "What do you want to do now?" she asked. "First, I'm going to talk to my parents." Abigail said, "They're leaving this afternoon, and I need to establish some boundaries. They've been controlling, and I've allowed it for too long. And I need to be honest about my business situation," Thomas continued. "Start fresh. Build something sustainable without taking shortcuts. As for Pine Haven," Abigail added, "we'd like to talk about a real plan, one that respects your ownership and the history of this place, while allowing us to share it in a way that works for everyone." Margaret was touched by their sincerity. "I'd like that." After breakfast, they found Victor Rodriguez outside, tending to the lilac bushes he'd saved. "Mr. Rodriguez," Margaret called, "I'd like you to meet my son and daughter-in-law properly." Victor straightened, wiping soil from his hands. "Pleasure to meet you both. Fine wedding yesterday." "We understand you saved these lilacs," Abigail said, gesturing to the potted plants. "Just doing what's right," Victor replied modestly. "We'd like to help you replant them." Thomas said, "Mom told us what they mean to the family." Victor's weathered face broke into a smile. "Well now, that would be something Mr. Evans would appreciate." Together, the four of them spent the morning replanting the lilacs in a new garden area that would blend with the modernized landscape while preserving the legacy plants. It was hot. Dirty work. Abigail's manicure was ruined, and Thomas's designer t-shirt was stained with soil, but neither complained. As they worked, Margaret shared stories of Pine Haven's early days, of George's dreams for the place, of Thomas as a boy learning to fish and swim in the lake. For the first time, she felt Abigail truly listening, truly caring about the history she was marrying into. By midday, the Harrison parents appeared, dressed for travel. Eleanor's eyebrows rose at the sight of her daughter covered in dirt, planting bushes. "Abigail, what on earth are you doing?" "Gardening, Mom." Abigail replied cheerfully. "We're replanting Margaret's lilacs." "But your honeymoon flight is postponed," Abigail finished, standing to face her parents. "Thomas and I have decided to stay here for a few days. We need to sort some things out." William frowned. "What about our discussion regarding the property?" "That's one of the things we need to sort out," Thomas said, joining his wife. "Margaret deserves to be part of any decisions about Pine Haven." Eleanor looked between them, then at Margaret, who was still kneeling by the lilacs. Something in Eleanor's expression shifted. A recognition, perhaps, of another mother who loved her child fiercely. "I see," she said simply. Abigail took a deep breath. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you before you leave, about boundaries, and about our relationship going forward." As Abigail led her parents back toward the house, Thomas helped Margaret to her feet. "That's not going to be an easy conversation," Margaret observed. "No," Thomas agreed. "But it's a necessary one, for all of us." Later that afternoon, after the Harrisons had departed, with less warmth than they'd arrived, but with a new understanding, Margaret found Abigail sitting on the dock, feet dangling in the water. "May I join you?" Margaret asked. Abigail nodded, making space. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the play of sunlight on the lake. "How did it go with your parents?" Margaret finally asked. Abigail sighed. "About as well as could be expected. They're hurt, confused, but I think they understand that things need to change. Change is hard, Margaret acknowledged, especially for parents who think they know what's best. Abigail gave her a sidelong glance. Is that why you didn't confront Thomas sooner about Pine Haven? Margaret considered the question. Partly, but also because I was afraid of losing him completely. Sometimes we hold on too loosely because we're afraid of holding too tight. I think I understand that now, Abigail said softly. After Jason died, my mother held on so tight she nearly suffocated me, and my father let go almost entirely. And you're trying to find the balance, Margaret observed. Abigail nodded. With Thomas, with you, with my parents. She dipped her toes in the water, creating ripples. I want to do better, be better. You already are, Margaret assured her. That evening, Thomas called for a family meeting at the kitchen table. He spread out paper and pens, looking more serious than Margaret had seen him in years. I want to talk about Pine Haven, he began, not as property, but as our family legacy. For the next hour, they discussed ideas for the future of the lake house. Thomas proposed a formal agreement Pine Haven would remain in Margaret's name, but they would establish clear expectations about its use and care. They would preserve key elements of its history while thoughtfully updating others. Most importantly, they would make decisions together as a family. And we'd like to start a new tradition, Abigail added, surprising both Thomas and Margaret. Every year, on your anniversary with George, we'll come here and plant something new, to honor the past while growing toward the future. Margaret was deeply moved by the gesture. I think George would have loved that. The following day, as they prepared to depart, Thomas and Abigail to their city apartment, Margaret back to her own home, they stood together on the porch, looking out at Pine Haven. It's still your home, Mom, Thomas said, arm around her shoulders. Whenever you want to be here. And it's where we'll bring our children someday, Abigail added, to learn about their grandfather and the house he built. Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Not everything was perfect. There were still conversations to be had, boundaries to establish, relationships to rebuild, but the foundation was strong. As she drove away, she called the Wednesday girls on her car's speakerphone. So, Betty demanded immediately, how did it end? Did they apologize? Dorothy asked. Is your house safe? Gladys chimed in. Margaret smiled as she turned onto the highway, Pine Haven growing smaller in her rearview mirror but larger in her heart. It ended with a beginning, she told her friends. A new path forward, together. And you, Gladys pressed. Are you okay? Margaret thought about the past few days, the pain and confrontation, but also the growth and reconciliation. She thought about George, and how he'd always told her that love wasn't about holding tight, but about growing together. I'm more than okay, she replied. I'm exactly where I need to be. 3 months later, the Wednesday girls gathered at Pine Haven for a weekend retreat. They sat on the porch in rocking chairs, watching the sunset over the lake. The lilacs were thriving in their new location, and Thomas and Abigail had added a memorial garden with a bench inscribed with George's name. You know, Betty observed, for a wedding that started with you being excluded, it turned out pretty well. Margaret laughed. That's life, isn't it? Sometimes the worst beginnings lead to the best endings. Or new beginnings, Dorothy corrected. Speaking of which, Gladys said, gesturing toward the drive where Thomas and Abigail's car was pulling in. They weren't alone. Jane was with them, along with several friends their age. Weekend visit, Betty asked. Something like that, Margaret said with a smile. Thomas is planning to restart his business, something about sustainable technology for older homes. He wants to use Pine Haven as a test site. And Abigail, Dorothy inquired. She's helping design the marketing. Turns out she's quite good at blending modern appeal with traditional values. As the younger generation unloaded their cars, calling greetings to Margaret and her friends, she felt George's presence beside her, as real as the evening breeze. "You see," she whispered to him, "I didn't disappear. I'm still here. And our family is bigger now." The silver brooch, returned to its velvet pouch after the wedding, rested in Margaret's pocket. Someday it would adorn another bride. Someday new children would learn to fish off the dock. Someday other hands would tend the lilacs. But today, in this moment, Margaret Evans was exactly where she belonged, at the heart of her family, visible, valued, and very much loved.